Got a question here from John Burris, particularly on this problem of one country. I don't think you mentioned was Hungary, because of all the upset that this has created in the relationships where now it's, I think, in the non-esprit, it's not part of the main political grouping. How would you answer, John, on how you handle this Hungarian question?
I mean, I maybe can start with a personal confession. The personal confession is that I brought Viktor Orban and Fidesz into the EPP in 1996, but at the time they were liberals. And the problem has been that they never stopped moving to the right. If they had stopped at a certain moment, it would have been all right. But unfortunately, on the three test questions I mentioned, constructive on European integration, not really for the moment. Reliable in transatlantic relations, we have seen how they behaved on NATO membership for Sweden, so not really. And the third question is democratic standards in Hungary, not really. So Hungary, unfortunately, has gone very far. Some people are now concerned because Hungary has the presidency of the Council of Ministers exactly during that time, but the Council of Ministers is not involved in the personnel selection. It's rather chairing work on legislation, and legislation is not going to happen during those 6 months because everybody will be busy with the new setup. So Hungary got the weakest and least influential presidency possible. So I hope, dear John, that this is more or less answering the question.
As you were mentioning, there's one aspect I'd like to bring up so we don't lose it, because as you're chairman of the Academic Council of the Wilfrid Martin Centre, a partner of ours, you have released a really interesting document called 7D on sustainability. And one of the aspects of this is on the European Union Defence Union. It's one of these subjects which is around, but I sense, and I'd love to have your response to this, that the debate seems now to be shifting from priorities of green to priorities on defence. Is this going to be part of the debate?
I think definitely so. You can hear it from Ursula von der Leyen, who is proposing a defense commissioner. You hear this from the EPP group, who is asking for a defense committee in the European Parliament. And in fact, I've been proposing a reflection paper, as you have mentioned, James, the 7Ds on sustainability last year in spring, where I try to outline 7 areas where I believe we are not yet future-proof. It starts with defense, but also debt, demography, democracy, digital, decarbonization, and de-risking globalization. And right now we are following this up with 7 in-depth documents. The first is out and has been distributed at the EPP Congress on defense, where I'm proposing a concept which is called the European Defense Pyramid, with actions the European Union could undertake, which are completely compatible with NATO. I would even argue they fulfill many of the requests our American friends have for a long time directed towards us. But they would also, in case that, for example, Donald Trump would decide to no longer be interested in that relationship, provide us with some base at least. So the concept is then outlined in more detail by 9 experts, which we recruited from all over Europe. So what is proposed is, I've been writing the why chapter as a non-specialist on defense. So why does it make sense? It makes sense because we have a hot war in Europe. It makes sense because we have a very explosive situation in Asia between China and America. And we have a much more volatile, unfortunately, situation in the United States. So what we should do is to build up defense capacity in the European Union, our defense industry in the European Union. We will have in view of the next MFF to invest into military mobility, where a small budget line is already available, but it's far from being sufficient. If, for example, we want to organize quick transport to the Baltics in case of a crisis. We will have to do more in dual-use research. That's why we are suggesting an EU DARPA. We will need to invest into strategic capability gaps. We know that air transport is one of them, but also satellite and space. We will need to continue to work on what Michel Barnier proposed a couple of years ago, a civil protection service. And then come issues which are more of a military component and would only probably come into more reflection once at least we have a clearer division of labor between NATO and the EU, when NATO is potentially saying that for conflicts in your immediate neighborhood, let's say Northern Africa, for example, which are of a small or medium scale, the EU should run these operations themselves, because then you need military command headquarters, for example. You need your own military doctrine, how you want to do this. So as far as I know, this is the first integrated concept available on defense and what the European Union can contribute. And it's meant as a stimulus for the debate ahead of the next legislature of the European Commission, and for everybody who wants to further this this debate. So this document can be downloaded in the Martin Center. That's how it looks like.
Yeah.
And we will follow up with 6 other in-depth documents on the 2nd of April on debt, digital, demography, democracy, decarbonization, and de-risking globalization, always with the help of renowned external experts.
Klaus, could I and then we have another question coming in, but just before we leave this subject, you were always one of the few back in 2019 who was asking the question, why is it that Putin has more than 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian frontier, and understanding geopolitically of how Europe was surrounded on the north and whatever, and the west and the east particularly, with danger. How much do you see what Macron is now saying, where the French are saying we need to be prepared for going much further in our European engagement? And I've understood from French sources that this is not just reflective of his fears of the Ukrainian stuff, but because of the Russian activities in Africa with the Wagner Group, and also with the Asian action which is being taken against the Comoros and others. So this is a global picture, which I understand Macron is. Is this a fair one, do you think? Because then how are you going to get the majorities in the new parliament for pushing this forward?
Yeah, I think we have to understand that Russia is a direct threat in the east, but let's also think about Syria. The Russian bombardment of Aleppo, which provoked major refugee movements, which probably were a contributing factor also to the Brexit vote in Great Britain, organizing instability on the continent, but also now in the Sahel, where the Wagner Group helped a couple of military regimes to take over and directly challenge the French position in Southern Africa. So it's not just that the eastern member states of the European Union are threatened. The southeastern and southern member states of the European Union are threatened as well. I think there's a second component. If really Ukrainian resistance would break down because of a lack of equipment or of ammunition, I have a serious doubt that the Polish would just wait that Mr. Putin approaches the Polish border. I cannot imagine that. So I think there is a situation where maybe not the EU as such, but at least Poland, maybe some other member states as well, would try to support the Ukrainians to avoid a breakdown of the resistance and the front.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Moving on from that, there is a specific question, as you might understand. We're in an EU-UK environment here, and we're very happy to see you with us. There is a question as to how you think that the European elections could mean for future, what it might mean for future UK-EU relations, particularly were the UK elections to be won by a party which isn't currently in power.
Yeah. Yeah, so that gives me then the opportunity to make a short reference to the UK elections. I think the general expectation now is that there would be a Labour win. That's no longer a very revolutionary assumption. I think the major assumption is also that Labour would still be very prudent in relations with the EU, maybe come to some additional sectoral agreements, as we have already seen on Horizon, at least on a first mandate, but move towards further constructive re-engagement without shaking the boat. I think on the conservative side, the issue remains how to react to the Reform Party. So there might be a temptation, as there is always an opposition, to go to more fundamentalist positions. So that means that the Conservative Party might need some more time to come then to a more constructive position on Europe again. I think in the European Union there's readiness to engage in a form which could be called fair and balanced, so where both take additional obligations, both take additional responsibilities, and both have additional advantages.
One question which has been asked is about the nature of support for populist parties on the continent compared to populist parties like Reform in the UK, without going into too glib a kind of comparison. But it seems that on the continent, it's a younger generation which is supporting the populist parties, whereas in the UK, it's an older generation which is supporting the populist parties. How can you explain this conundrum?
Yeah, I think we have a very mixed picture. I mean, if I see assemblies of the German AfD party, it's still very male, and it's not so much the younger generation. If you see, on the other hand, Bardella and the French Le Pen party, then with the candidate who might be the candidate for prime minister of 28 years of age, I think they can have a certain appeal. So I've tried to go through scientific literature, and it's not very clear that we have a trans-European trend in, let's say, how these demographics are exactly composed. There are studies, but then you find studies who say the opposite. I believe we have to do much more additional work into what is driving this development. There are basically two models. One is a cultural model, as a kind of cultural reaction to a move too far to the left. The other one is an economic and social model. Personally, I'm more a believer in this economic and social model. Take Italy, which has had consecutive populist parties trying to govern the country. One of the reasons might be that Italy didn't have any growth for 20 years, on average, zero growth. But even when you look at Germany, the growth development from after the Second World War to now is a downward trend, which was at 5% after the Second World War and is now around 0%. So there are years where it is per capita GDP. So there are years where growth is positive per capita. There are years like this year where it's negative. It's also clear that real wages for low-income earners have not increased for a very long time, according to some statistics, during decades. So I think we need to invest more research into the social background of this, where we have electorates that might in the past have voted the extreme left, like, for example, in northern France, but the same electorates are now supporting the extreme right.
That is the circle of politics, which one got used to, having very right-wing Gaullists which were almost communist, but that was in some 30 years ago. A question which arises from this then is on the economic side of things. Draghi has been, as former Italian Prime Minister, has been asked to write a report on competitiveness. So I presume that will be part of the von der Leyen campaign. where do you think there's going to be some magic wand which will come to increase European competitivity so as to not lose the Americans entirely on the other side of the Atlantic?
I don't know what Draghi is proposing, but I can maybe in this context hint at the recent European Parliament report on the cost of non-Europe, where I think the figure of additional growth potential by refocusing on the internal market was put at somewhere like 1.4 trillion. A lot is in the service sector, where maybe we have been more regulating risks than regulating to create opportunity, including in the digital. And I had some months ago the opportunity to speak with young digital entrepreneurs, and they were saying exactly that. They were saying, okay, it's good that Europe gives us some clear orientation on what can be done, what cannot be done, but does it mean that our growth has to happen in the United States? So my question was, what would you need? And for me, the bit surprising answer was, we need an integrated banking system across the European Union. We don't really have banking union with very different rules. And secondly, we need a capital market union. So on both of those, we haven't made major advantage. So we still have, an internal market focusing heavily on the industrial sector and on goods, but that's what's shrinking. And the growing internal market we should have, which is on services, is probably insufficiently developed, maybe following also the Bolkestein disaster at the time, which wanted to do too much at a time. So I think we have to refocus on competitiveness, on the internal market. I understand that the EPP will pressure in this direction. I've also seen the Congress preparation of the Liberals, the ALDE party, Congress that is happening on the 20th of March. And all their announcements in advance are on competitiveness. So there will be a push into the direction of competitiveness. And it's also positive that both Mario Draghi and also Enrico Letta are working on the file.
There has been often a question asked in our country where you can find that we don't have the same kind of phenomenon as we say of Bardella of the change as the party as 13-14% of the vote in recent campaigns. However, the question that I have for you is that you were talking about the voting for von der Leyen, for the candidate, when it comes into the parliament in July, as to which parties can be part of the broader majority. The question is, will this turn into a slightly more wide cooperation, do you think, in the next parliament, with someone like Meloni, who seems to have come a huge way from the Brothers of Italy on the far right now to having a much more centre-right kind of focus, if I might say so, with, of course, Tajani, who's a good friend of yours, as foreign minister. How do you think this is likely to play out?
I mean, up to now, the real dividing line on the right is between pro-Americans, which are in the ECR group, and pro-Russians, which are in the ID group. That's the dividing line. The question is, will this dividing line be overcome also in light of the Russian aggression against Ukraine? Or in other words, will parties which were on the pro-Russian line sufficiently change their positioning? There are some indications for a potential realignment. You have a conflict now between Le Pen and the German AfD, because the German AfD, one of the candidates, probably the lead candidate, was part of a meeting where they suggested that millions of Germans of third country origin should be encouraged, in brackets or in hyphens, to leave the country. Madame Le Pen has expressed very clearly that for them this is a completely unacceptable position. In fact, if you think back to Germany of the 1930s, that is what happened to the Jewish population. They were encouraged in, let's say, inverted commas, to leave the country. And we know where this has been leading to finally. So there is a rift opening on the very right between the AfD, which is continuing to radicalize, and on the other hand, Le Pen, who tries to become more presentable for the presidential elections in 2027. Equally, in the ECR group, there is a rift between the Polish Law and Justice, which is now more and more radicalizing after they lost power, and on the other hand, people like Meloni, the ODS, the NBA, or maybe the Latvians. So will this lead to a reorganization of that political space into new entities? That I don't know. But it is clear that that there are dividing lines within both groups on the right and on the very right, between Le Pen and the AfD, and in the ECR group between Meloni, ODS, NBR, and the Polish Law and Justice Party.
Yeah, well, as we're a network which has in our title the Ideas Network 2030, looking beyond 2030, there is a big question for the mandate of the next parliament to know what changes, if any, will be made institutionally to welcome Ukraine, who is now a candidate country. So how do you see that beginning to play out with all these other complex issues which are having to be handled? I know that you have an institutional feel to as to how these things may develop indeed towards 2029.
I think there are three different issues which are being discussed. One I call a little bit disrespectful, the leftover issues from the past. So should really every country have a commissioner and qualified majority voting in different council formations? I think that will only get us so far because member states made a decision, a conscious decision, that they will want somebody at the commission table. Even if the value of an individual commissioner, I think, has very much decreased, and we are now in a situation where the commission has turned more or less into a presidential system. But there are two issues which I think need to be addressed and are decisive. The first is on budget. We cannot do these enlargements, surely not with Ukraine, without a serious debate on how this is going to be financed and own resources for the European Union. And we have seen already with the COVID crisis that with Next Generation EU, suddenly 300 billion additional debt was created. There was a vague promise, even quite precise promise, on how this could be financed from own resources, but those own resources were not created up to now. So the issue of own resources, stable financing of the European Union, something Alain Lamassoure has been working on for 10 years, becomes very important. And the Martin Center has invited Alain Lamassoure to write the chapter on own resources within our 7D for sustainability fruit document. And he has agreed to do that. So I believe that's an issue that has to come back if enlargement towards the Balkans and Ukraine has to be realistic. The second issue is that I believe we need to become serious on European foreign policy, security, and defense. I do not believe that the foreign ministers are the right body, but I could imagine that on really major important issues in these areas, there could be a decision by qualified majority in the European Council on the proposal of the European Commission, where maybe the External Action Service is reintegrated. So to find a new balance, give the European Council a decision-making which absolutely fits into the system, because the European Council nowadays is a kind of collective presidency of the Union. And that's normally an issue where presidencies are occupied with, in France, in the United States, foreign affairs, security, and defense. And I think after the most recent experience with Viktor Orban, blockade on Ukraine support, there is a clear case for qualified majority voting there. Will it be easy to get there? No. Is it important? Absolutely, because we will live in a very uncomfortable world, which might become even more uncomfortable depending on the outcome of the American elections. So, in a resume, budget, foreign affairs, security, and defense, but not focus too much on the leftover issues from past treaty negotiations.
So, in time-wise, the question comes: is that 2029 for Ukraine to enter in 2034? Is that the realistic perspective?
It all depends. I think Ukraine needs at a certain moment peace in order to be really able to develop. And that creates a major incentive for Vladimir Putin not to agree to any peace, because he's not interested in that development. So the question is, in 2024, Ukraine will be on the defensive, Russia will be on the offensive. If Ukraine can keep the front, and if then in November in the United States, a president is elected who is ready to continue to support Ukraine, then we might have favorable preconditions to try to find an acceptable solution for Ukraine. Because as long as the war is dragging on, it will de facto be very difficult to integrate also with a huge part of the population, especially of the active population and younger population living abroad. So I think calendar depends on that a peace settlement is found. Will not be this year, but if Ukraine can defend itself, if we can ramp up production, and if a favorable administration is in place in the United States, that might then be the moment to deal with that.
Touching on the transatlantic partnership, which you have done, is one of the three pillars which were mentioned in your introduction. Let's suppose that the American economy continues to grow more rapidly and that Biden actually wins. What would you do in the next 4 or 5 years to strengthen the transatlantic partnership, given the threats which come from all sides on its existence and its ability to operate effectively?
I believe that independently who is president in the United States, the Europeans need to prepare to largely assure their conventional defense themselves. The Americans will more and more have to focus on Asia. And I think the argument they are making that we are grown up now, that we are functioning economies, that we can shoulder more of the burden is correct. But let's say the nuclear protection from the United States and a complementary conventional support will remain important. But I think to re-establish a new balance between European efforts and American efforts on our continent is important, given the challenge the Americans are facing in Asia. There is a deep relationship of trust between Joe Biden and Ursula von der Leyen, and that's something we could build on.